From the far reaches of the Milky Way galaxy, it's Retro Nerd Girl with a film review for you. Today, I'll be reviewing the movie Dune, released in 1984. Starring Kyle MacLachlan, Virginia Madsen, and Francesca Annis. Directed by David Lynch. The synopsis is, the son of Duke Leto Atreides, Paul Atreides, discovers that he has been bred to be the super being, the Kwisatz Haderach. He must defeat the Baron Harkonnen and the Padishar Empress Saddam IV by raising an army and controlling the most important commodity of the known universe, the spice melange. Sorry guys for making such a long review. I tried to make it shorter, but there's just so much that I wanted to cover in this review. And if you desire to read the entire review that I wrote, you can find it at my blog, and the link is in the description of this video. Alright, without further ado, here's the review. Now the story. The movie is based on the brilliant fantasy sci-fi novel Dune, published in 1965, written by Frank Herbert. This is definitely one of my favorite books of all time. Frank Herbert got the idea to write Dune in 1953 while traveling through Florence, Oregon, and learned of some agricultural development that would control the flow of sand dunes, keeping them from roads and other locations occupied by humans. This also made him more curious about ecology and many cultures that exist in desert regions globally. That is precisely why much of the book uses Arabic and Islamic terms. He was also fascinated by the people of the Kalahari Desert in South Africa and how they conserve every drop of water. He read over 200 books for his research before he began writing a 3-part series, Dune World, in the monthly analog magazine from December 1963 to February 1964, along with illustrations by award-winning artist John Schooner. A year later, he published a 5-part series, The Prophet of Dune, from January to May of 1965. When Herbert shopped around his 800-page novel, Dune, it was rejected by over 20 publishers before it was finally accepted and published in August of 1965 by Chilton Books. The funniest thing is that this publisher was known for publishing auto repair manuals, crafting, and hobby books. The novel was a huge hit. To this day, it is considered one of the best-selling science fiction novels ever written. After the novel's success, Herbert went on to write 5 more books in the Dune saga. Dune Messiah in 1969, Children of Dune 1976, God Emperor of Dune in 1981, Heretics of Dune in 1984, and finally Chapter House, Dune in 1985. His son Brian Herbert took the reins along with Kevin J. Anderson after Herbert's death to write prequel novels. So now you get an idea of how popular Dune was and still is. Now let's rewind back to the 1970s when there were many attempts to make Dune into a feature film. No one got closer than Alejandro Jodorowsky. As the story goes, producer Arthur P. Jacobs bought the rights in 1971, but when he died in 1973, it landed in the hands of the French consortium, led by Jean-Paul Gibbon, with Alejandro Jodorowsky at the helm to direct. In 2013, the documentary Jodorowsky's Dune was released, describing in great detail the director's vision for the project, shocking Dune lovers around the world about what might have been. Funding the film proved to seal the doom for this project. As well, Frank Herbert made it known that he was not a fan of this interpretation because of the changes to the story that were to be made. In a way, it's probably better that the author's work wasn't used in a way that he didn't support. Producer Dino De Laurentiis had been eyeing Jodorowsky's progress all along and scooped up the rights to the film as soon as it became available. In an attempt to get an accurate interpretation of the book, Frank Herbert was asked to write the screenplay for the film, which he did in 1978. However, it was 175 pages long. But get this is really juicy, guys. In the biography of Jack Nicholson, 5 Easy Decades, the book claimed that in the late 1970s that Jack Nicholson actually considered directing Dune. He decided to pass on it and also later turned down being cast in the eventual flick as the Duke's warrior Gurney Halleck. Ridley Scott was actually hired to direct and wisely decided to split the book into 2 movies. But sadly, after 7 months of working on the film, he dropped out when his older brother died of cancer. Ridley Scott was then replaced by David Lynch, who at the time was a young artist with 2 films of massive critical acclaim under his belt: The Elephant Man, released in 1980, and Eraserhead, released in 1977. He was hired at the request of De Laurentiis' daughter, who became the first female producer of a multi-million-dollar film while working on Dune, Raffaella De Laurentiis. Lynch had a 3-picture deal. He was also charged with rewriting the screenplay. It was still a bit long, clocking in at about 2.5 hours, but the studio wanted 1 movie, and 1 movie they received. The final result was, as many film adaptations are, an attempt to tell the novel story in a linear fashion, along with a few additions to express the filmmaker's interpretation and creativity. I'll definitely get into more of the differences between the 2 formats as we get deeper into the review, but for the most part, I'll just tell you that I love the film and what was done with it. I know, it's not a popular opinion. I totally understand why people would not like this film because it's flawed in so many ways. And one of the biggest complaints, since we're on story, that people have with the film is the massive exposition that's in it. In fact, before the story begins, depending on which version you watch, a character by the name of Princess Irulan, who is the Emperor's daughter, explains the different factions of the known universe and their desire to control the production of the spice melange. I thought it was excellent. I loved it. And in doing this, though, many viewers felt confused as the film divulges more exposition as it goes along, strange terms that they don't understand, and characters' inner dialogue that is actually heard throughout the film. I'm a bit eccentric, so of course I loved every moment of it. And even at the tender age of 14 back in 1984, I loved it. I couldn't get enough of it, okay? And that's not to say that I understood the film completely. I hadn't even read the book at this point, but I did enjoy the weirdness of it all, the sci-fi of it all, and it made me so intrigued. I mean, what is a Kwisatz Haderach and a Padishah Emperor? I mean, please give me more, give me more. Another challenge for the story was that many of the occurrences in the book were wisely avoided in the film to keep the morality of the 1984 audience in mind. It avoids the book's mention of slavery, rape, incest, pedophilia, and the fact that our main character, Paul Atreides, and the Baron's nephew, Fade Routha, are only 15 years old. And they're both doing very, very mature things in the book. That was one of the other reasons why it was perceived that Dune was unfilmable. Now the pacing. At 2 hours and 17 minutes, it's very slow paced and you feel every bit of those 2 hours. But if you're into the style and rhythm of the first 10 minutes of the film, the last 30 minutes of the film is a true epic spectacle. Now the challenge. There are several challenges in the film against the main character, Paul Atreides. The main villain portrayed in the film is the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen from the House Harkonnen on planet Giedi Prime. Now, what's not in the film is a serious backstory that's left out. The backstory is that 10,000 years earlier, the Harkonnens were banished for cowardice by the House Atreides. So there's a serious rift between the two houses. The Harkonnens have since gained their respectability. I mean, it took 10,000 years, but the feud is still heavy and hot between these two houses of nobility. Now, the Baron is working with the Emperor of the known universe to utterly destroy the House Atreides to satisfy his family vendetta. Now, what the film also leaves out is that he hopes that his nephew will marry the Emperor's daughter, the Princess Irulan, to have him ascend to the throne. After being shamed for thousands of years, there is no better satisfaction for the Baron than to have a Harkonnen on the throne. Now, it's an excellent motivation for the character, so I love that. It's not explained in the film, but based on the book, the motivation is great. But again, none of that is in the movie. And maybe some of this was intended to be in the film. Yes, because at the end of the film, you see Fade Routha just strangely, hanging out next to the Emperor, but it's not certain why. But after reading the book and knowing about what happened, yes, it makes sense because he's in favor with the court to ascend to the throne. Now, I had a lot of fun watching the Baron and his antics in this movie. He's a malicious, boisterous man relishing his power with absurdity. At one point, he takes a shower with some black liquid, and at first I thought it was chocolate. Like, he's really kind of a weird one there. He's taking a bath in chocolate. But on second thought, I thought that perhaps this was spice, which kind of makes it seem as if, okay, I can buy that's the spice because he's basically tripping on spice, and that's why his behavior is so bold and big and boisterous. He's just high on spice. So, yeah, I thought that was interesting. So now Paul has more enemies. The next one is the Emperor, who is from the House Carino on the planet of Kaitain. And, sadly, somehow the Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV is related to the House Atreides. They're cousins of some sort. However, the emperor's status is being threatened by the fact that Paul's father, Duke Leto, is gaining popularity in the assembly of noble families. The third party of this opposition for Paul is the Spacing Guild, which is an organization that provides space travel for the entire universe. And they can only do this with the spice melange that is collected from the desert planet Arrakis known as Dune. The Guild space navigators are mutated humans that use the spice in order to fold space and travel light years without moving. Now, the spacing guildmen have foreseen that their spice production will be in trouble if Paul Atreides is allowed to live. So they've kind of entered themselves into this massive plot to destroy the House Atreides to protect the flow of spice. The Spacing Guild definitely flex a lot of muscle with the Emperor, pretty much bossing him around, and that is because they have true control over the universe. Now, there are many famous lines from the movie, but one of them in particular that stands out is from the Baron. He who controls the spice controls the universe. And so he who controls the spice controls the guild. So when it suits the guild, they change sides. They simply empower whomever has control of the spice production. Likewise, they have so much pull because the space travel is so important to life in the known universe. Now, the last opposition for Paul is the Bene Gesserit sisterhood, who have been secretly manipulating genetic bloodlines to create the Kwisatz Haderach. Now, this is a super being that will take the throne of the emperor, and it would be as if a Bene Gesserit was on the throne that they could control. The sisterhood presents themselves as servants and advisors, truth-sayers to men in power, and the motive is about power and protection. They would have their way except for the fact that Paul was born and hidden away from their influence. Now, the empathy. The empathy for the characters is something that builds. It's not always there, unfortunately, because there's so many characters that it's really hard to really care about them when they died or vanished out of the story. And I won't get into every character, but we can start with Duke Leto, Paul's father. The Duke is given the opportunity by the Emperor to take over spice production on the planet Arrakis. He takes the job knowing that it's a trap and that it will endanger the lives of every Atreides in his household. He's a man driven and trapped by his noble duty, whether it makes sense or not. In the film, you can often see him in some kind of contemplation, and he acts like he knows that he's going to die. There's a feeling of regret for his past, like not marrying the love of his life for political advantages. Paul's father's life is very tragic, but just so you get a bit of a backstory, there's more detail of it in the book. Paul's mother, the Lady Jessica, is a Bene Gesserit, and she was bought from the sisterhood by the Duke to be his secretary. Yeah, that's pretty gross, but in this world, you can buy people. Duke Leto and the Lady Jessica fell in love, in which he asked her to bear him a male child, even though Bene Gesserits are ordered to only bear female children. Let's just pause a minute. Don't you think that's kind of cool that they can control the sex of their unborn child? I mean, that's pretty cool. That's why I love Dune so much. There's so much detail in there that's so cool and so different. Now, Paul is the result of that union. In the film and the book, Paul is pretty arrogant. He's entitled because of his nobility. He's not unkind, though, but he's just really wrapped up into the title of being the Duke's son. And that sense of duty is present in both father and son. In many ways, they're doomed to make the same choices in service of duty. It can be hard to find someone like this, likable and truly. Frank Herbert didn't write the character to be likable or to be a hero, because Paul's part in the story is a small part of a bigger tale with a profound message. Paul really grows on you because of his trials and tribulations. He has many attempts on his life. He loses his dad and many family friends to the Harkonnens, has to fight for his life in the desert, and restore the honor of his family name. We can definitely understand the suffering in this journey, and we definitely root for him by the end of the tale. And really, in the end, as much as they're enemies, Paul and the Baron seek the same thing, retribution, and I love that connection. One other thing that helps to humanize Paul is the fact that he meets Chani, who is his love interest. And in the book, even though these characters are 15 years old, they have children, and that part was wisely left out of the movie as well. In order to restore his family's name, Paul Atreides must get the help of the Fremen, who are the desert people who live on planet Arrakis. And separate from what we already know about the Dune universe, the Fremen have within them a prophecy of Muad'Dib, which has been laid in by the Bene Gesserit over many centuries. The way it's handled in the film is much more subtle, whereas in the book it's pretty obvious that Paul and Jessica are just taking advantage of their situation. And leaving that out really helps, because then we get to side with Paul and Jessica as part of the hero narrative. Now, the technical aspects. Mexico was chosen as the location which had the correct aesthetics for the film, which coincidentally was the same location and filming for Conan the Destroyer, released in 1984, another movie that I plan to review in the future. The cast and crew came down with Montezuma's Revenge, which is a diarrhea experienced by tourists after drinking the water or eating food in Mexico. And this is a result of a bacteria strain to which native Mexicans are immune. That meant that a whole lot of money had to be put into building a cafeteria, providing the entire cast and crew with food and water imported from the United States for every meal. Now let's talk about the look of the film. The concept of nearly everything in this film is so dynamic to me, blending a hint of fashion from Baroque and Tudor eras. It's probably my favorite part of the film, the actual aesthetics. Many critics of the film hate the look, mainly because of how dark and strangely the Harkonnens were portrayed. However, I feel the filmmakers brilliantly meant to really upset viewers when watching the Harkonnens. Not one compassionate or admirable visual was given to the House Harkonnen to show the horrors that they couldn't reveal from the book. The Baron is immoral, cruel, and vicious. The filmmakers really want you to know that by making him a disgusting, sore-infested mass. He is in pain internally. He suffers externally as well for the benefit of the audience to see this. Gidi Prime is like a planet of horrors, and I think that it was really creative to project the savagery of their mentality as a visual in their world, so gritty and putrid. Again, it's a creative visual to describe their lack of morality and disregard for human life other than their own. The costuming for the Bene Gesserit were outstanding, denoting their feminine mystique and dedication to the sisterhood by shaving their hair. Wow, what a powerful image it was to see these gorgeous and glorious bald women. I thought it was totally mind-blowing in 1984, and I still love it. There was so much detail given to all of the costumes, and I enjoyed how they matched this creation of the Dune universe by being dark and vastly textured and imbued with a sense of drama and flair. And I love the way that the different factions of people had different looks completely. They were all distinct from each other, and I love that. All of the costumes weren't wowing, but 90% of them were just mind-blowing and amazing to me. The sets are just amazing in this film. Just ridiculously amazing. Full of detail in the moldings. What artistry! Each set is drenched in exotic textures and motifs befitting the finest museums in the universe. And it takes my breath away when I see them, and I recognize that they actually existed. They weren't miniatures or painted backdrops, but real spaces for the actors to move around in. I can only imagine the many long hours of work it took to create each one. Now, in particular, there's a few that stand out, but the Emperor's throne room was absolutely exquisite, with the luxury and opulence of his rank and wealth, while still embodying a sense of age and strength simultaneously. I just want that back wall with all of that detailing somewhere in my home. It is gorgeous. It just astounds me how many amazing locations the movie displays. This world building is part of the enjoyment for me, and a lot of it was done with miniatures. It's such a staple in cinema, but all of the really amazing visuals came from this technique. Toto was brought in to create the epic instrumental music for the film. Toto was a very popular band in the 1980s, and actually 70s and 80s. And the Vienna Volksoper Choir joined them. Now, the prophecy theme in the movie was composed by Brian Eno, and much of the background music as well. It was a fantastic score, befitting a rock and roll Shakespearean space opera. Now, the performances. The casting for this film was ridiculously amazing, and all of the performances were stellar in this movie. Just incredibly outstanding. Every actor in this film did their part to make this film an incredible fantasy epic, making much of the film's highly quotable moments iconic. And I won't get into every single performance, but I will talk about some of the main character actors. first, we'll talk about Paul Atreides, Muad'Dib, played by Kyle MacLachlan, who did a wonderful job playing the character. He definitely captures the arrogance of the young Duke's son, but also gives him something charismatic for the audience to hold on to that's not in the written form. As the film progresses, the audience falls deeper in admiration for the character and the actor. This was the film debut for Kyle MacLachlan, who had been a stage actor prior to this. This film also began a long professional relationship with David Lynch. Francesca Annis was a vital pulse to this story, playing the beautiful Lady Jessica. Lady Jessica is a very tricky character to play because one of the reasons why Glenn Close turned down the role was because she considered the character as the girl who is always running and falling down behind the men. Ouch! But it's pretty much true, especially how she's written in the book. She's ridiculed and attacked by commoners, and even Paul talks down to her on occasion, which she has to put up with. This proves how hard it is to make the Lady Jessica a dignified character in the story. And perhaps this influenced the filmmakers because a lot of the insults to the character in the book didn't take place in the film. Francesca portrays her with an incredible ability to be vulnerable, regal, and powerful when needed. She infused the Lady Jessica with a great deal of poise and strength. Many of the cast in this film went on to work with David Lynch in future projects for TV and film. I really want to talk about every actor, but it's more of the same, of how I love their performance, and thusly I became lifelong fans of theirs. I know that I'm not alone because many people often say that this movie was the introduction to many of these great actors and their incredible talents. Recording artist Sting played Fade with a great deal of boyish fun and energy, while embellishing the malice of his character with his facial expressions. And really, that was all that he had to work with because unfortunately he had hardly much to say in the film. But what we received of him was surprisingly good. I know that many people who went to see the movie was quite disappointed that he had such a small role, being that many of the posters featured him on the cover. And I think that was a really bad move marketing-wise because people had a different idea of what the film actually was. It was just something that people were very unhappy with and made a big deal about. Rightfully so. Now the ending. The ending is a source of much controversy, and I totally understand why. Now let me explain it all. Leading up to the end is an incredible epic battle facing off Paul's army of Fremen against the Emperor's Sardaukar warriors. There's even a spectacular blade combat between Paul and Fade. Paul is given the robe of the Emperor and then proceeds to magically create rain on Arrakis. And, for me personally, I can accept the ending for what it is. It ends the story. But it leaves many questions for people, more questions than necessary, and that is what leads me right into the next segment. My wish list. So just to let you know in advance, I do love the film as it is and in its many versions that are available. Just, look, I love Dune, so just give me more Dune. That's all I have to say is give me more Dune. I don't care how you give it to me, just give me more Dune. But my first wish is that I wish that this movie was a movie that everyone loved, and we could have been seeing Dune Chapter House in theaters by now. Now, from watching several interviews from cast and crew, the main goal of the production was to turn Dune into a franchise that was a version of Star Wars for adults. In fact, that term was actually used, Star Wars for adults. Like, just hearing that breaks my heart. Even though the rumor has it that Star Wars was heavily inspired by the novel Dune, Dune for me I feel is in its own lane of sci-fi material. So perhaps this is why the heavy emphasis on visual effects was placed in the film. But unfortunately, many of these effects were unrefined. Many critics had commented that many of the effects looked very cheap, and I wouldn't disagree with it, which could have been really a result of the project running out of money. Some of the chroma keying blue screen work was a great example of this issue. It just wasn't up to snuff. My next wish is about the ending, and it really needs explaining. Granted, this is only one rainfall. We're not informed how far the range is, but it leaves more questions for the people who have read the book. Because the book informs us that water is deadly to the worms, and the rain Paul conjures up would ultimately destroy the worms and the spice production. As well, the book informs us that most of these characters are also bound by the spice, that they need it in order to stay alive now that they've been exposed to so much of it. So in doing this, the film misses the entire point of Dune and the series as a whole. The legend of Muad'Dib is a contrived tool by the Bene Gesserit to subdue the Fremen people on Arrakis. Paul is a fake. Unfortunately, I hate saying that even though I love him. Paul is a fake, and the story is a warning for humans not to blindly follow leaders. This really makes me wish that the ending was just simply Paul ascending to the throne, the end. So let's go into enjoyment. The first cut of the film was over 4 hours long and was rejected from the studio. It was reshot and edited down to almost 3 hours long, and then it was cut into 2 hours and 17 minutes long. Very interesting. The studio felt it was too confusing for audiences, so an introduction by Virginia Madsen was added to explain the Dune universe. And maybe it was overkill or setting the precedents for weirdness, but during the film's original release, cheat sheets were handed out to all of the moviegoers. Unfortunately, it was a disaster, coming $10 million short of its budget, and the reviews were alarmingly scathing, to say the least. Every critic had their day with this film. There were a few favorable reviews at the time that acknowledged the faults in the film, but praised the attempt. Dune was also nominated for an Academy Award for Best Sound. Science fiction writer Harlan Ellison was a big supporter of the film and spilled a little tea when he said in his book, Harlan Ellison's Watching, released in 1989, that critics were denied screenings at the last minute after several reschedules, and the community flooded the film with negative reviews, in his opinion, as a result. Now, for me and a select few, the original movie excited and delighted us at the time when we wanted to see science fiction and travel to other worlds. Over the years, television airings of the movie kept the flame going for the film, sparking interest for a lot of people who didn't even know that there was a book called Dune. It opened up Frank Herbert's fascinating world to a new fan base of 80s kids and many generations afterwards. It's a very unpopular opinion, but I can't help it. I love Dune 1984. It's my guilty pleasure. Father! The sleeper has awakened! I've always wanted to say that. My rating is a 9. Well, that sums up my review. I hoped you liked it. This is Retro Nerd Girl signing off. Take care, movie lovers. I'm off to my next review.